If I could start with you, Tim, when it was asked during your talk was, how would the degrowth dilemma be different if we used a measure other than GDP, such as GPI? Does addressing sustainability require changing GPI or some other FNA?
System of National Accounts, SNA, yeah. It absolutely does. And it's clear that different measures do make a difference. I tend to think that there is still a dilemma that goes beyond just measurement, what you measure. And it really does hang around this question of employment and labour productivity. In an economy, whatever you're measuring, if it's increasing labour productivity, you have to manage the availability of the work in that economy, and you have to have institutions, as Peter has shown very clearly in his model, where it's possible to share the available work and ensure that you're matching the aggregate supply with the aggregate demand in the economy, because it's when that matching doesn't take place that the economy actually becomes unstable, and when economies become unstable, then bad things happen. So the measurement question is absolutely key. It's really important, but it also requires us to look at the dynamics and at the institutions that support those dynamics.
Thanks very much. Okay, Robert, if I could just address one to you. The question is, what does the panel consider, and I guess this could be open to the rest of the panel, what does the panel consider should be the role of NGOs, community-based organisations, in preparing the communities with whom they work to face the societal changes that climate change is predicted to bring?
Well, I think the role of NGOs is going to be critical, and I think one way of thinking about that is that we need a whole new sector of the economy. That's the commons sector to deal with natural and social capital, and I think that's where NGOs can play a major role. But also other institutions can play a major role. The idea of common asset trusts at several scales that we can develop and probably need to be managed by NGOs and not necessarily by government. Let me just say one thing about the labor productivity question, though. Like I think that our increases in labor productivity historically have been driven largely by substituting energy for labor. And as energy becomes more expensive in the future, if we shift to renewable energies, they're not going to have necessarily the same energy return on investment. So I can foresee a future where labor productivity after peak oil doesn't continue to increase in the same way that it did in the past, and that won't be such a pressing issue on what to do with that extra labor productivity that we may or may not have.
Okay, thanks. I'll just
pick up?
Please, yeah.
Just on Bob's point about labour productivity, I would absolutely agree with that, and I think there's all sorts of reasons why we might not want a society which systematically chases increased labour productivity. Let me just explain through, there's been a lot of calls for a different engine of growth, and the different engine of growth is really tasked around having different sets of economic activities. What are those economic activities? Well, largely in the way that people have talked about them, they've been service-based activities where instead of material throughput as the basis of profitability, it's the services that the enterprise can give to the community or to people who want those goods and services. And there's a really interesting point about those services, which is that in many cases, it's the labour input that is the unique selling point that provides the value of those services. So to systematically chase labour out of those activities is very counterproductive and counterintuitive. So I think there's much more scope for not accepting labour productivity as the defining shape of the future economy.
Thank you. Okay. Peter, I'll just ask you one now, and then there's a few general ones that I'll open up to the whole panel. But for Peter, the cultural changes shifting from consumption values to community values, for example, are political suicide for short-term focused governments to attempt without support from the population. How can people be persuaded on such a complex subject?
Well, it's a terrific question, and I agree with the sentiment that lies behind it. I think I mentioned that my concern that so many of our institutions, including the political ones, seem to be increasingly short-sighted. But somebody else asked a question about NGOs, and it seems to me that NGOs are playing. It's not a question of what they have to do in the future, but already are playing a very important role in trying to address some of these cultural questions and to challenge the values upon which our society seems to be built. And I use the word NGO very broadly. I mean, some of the faith communities are doing the same sorts of things. So, it's horrible to use the cliche of a tipping point. We haven't reached that yet. But I think that the recent recession has left a lot of people very disillusioned with what they thought was the status quo, was a sort of a predictable future based upon the past, and it hasn't worked out that way. And you're seeing a lot of people saying, I'm never going to get into such levels of debt anymore, and I want to use my time differently, and I've discovered other ways of enjoying life. And so it's a question of how we build on these embers to start a fire of cultural change. I agree with whoever asked the question that's a fundamental challenge, and it won't be a top-down activity. I don't think it'll be bottom-up, and the top will eventually fall into line.
Can I add one thing to that too?
Yes,
I think this cultural change is in progress, very much so. And one indication of that is there's a recent book by Paul Ray called The Cultural Creatives, where they categorize the U.S. population into 3 categories: the modernists, traditionalists, and cultural creatives. The last category are the people who I think have the worldview that we're espousing and have made this sort of cultural change, at least on a personal level. The surprising thing is that fraction of the U.S. population is now up to about 30%. And so there are many more and rapidly increasing. The recent recession, I think, has accelerated that. And so there will come a tipping point when that fraction of the population is large enough to be a critical mass and to really change the way we perceive what it is we're doing, our goals, our institutions, etc. Make the kind of changes that we all see are necessary to solve this problem.